this is why this topic's so relevant to mental health and the work that I do and talking about well-being and being able to show up and be your best self. Well, you can't do that if you're, consistently being devalued and having these things, I don't know, not just taken away from you, but shown as you're not important. Welcome to the Conversations with Julie podcast. I'm your host, Julie Gillespie. Today, I get to talk to Rodo De Boer. Now, the conversation that we're having is in regards to the resource sector. So that's drilling, mining, quarry, like it takes in all sorts of different aspects and industry. But it relates to so much more than that. I think any industry these conversations relate to. And it just makes it that much more meaningful. But Rodo is an industry leader. So he's the CEO of the Resource Training Council, which is recognised as the voice of resource training in Australia. The Resource Training Council's mission is to influence and shape policy to deliver better training and safety outcomes for workforces in resources and associated industries. Rodo is a highly experienced resources professional with over 30 years' experience in the mining and the oil and gas industries. He started on the shop floor in mining, spending his first 10 years as an underground miner before moving into management roles. With a proven track record of relationship building and being able to positively engage with all stakeholders, from employees to senior managers, clients, contractors, and regulators. Now, I first came across Rodo when I was reaching out to some of my safety colleagues to say, what can I be doing more in the safety industry to start conversations that help support people who've got mental ill health? And Angelina Badri, hey, Angelina, call out. Thank you very much for putting me in touch with the Resource Training Council. And I became a member, and very quickly, Rodo reached out and said, hey, Julie, we need to have a conversation. And it's like, this guy already speaks my language. Yes, thank you very much. And he wanted me to speak at the Resource Training Council conference about mental health. And I said, well, let's have a conversation about that, because I think there might be something else. Don't know why I said that. Normally I jump at the chance. When we had this conversation, we caught up and I wanted to know, what is it that he's wanting to change? What is it that he's wanting to do? And there was this idea of wanting to help people progress in their career and to be safe and to, go home to their families at the end of each day and to be able to really influence that. And I asked what I thought at the time was a really simple question of what's motivated you specifically, Rodo, to go from competency, being in the mine and doing your job, to one where you've reached for excellence, for proficiency. What's motivated that? And the conversation was fascinating. Like, it really brought out so many different aspects that we hadn't even thought about before in the space of mental health and well-being, because what we talked about was how he felt his value, how he wanted to be valued for those things, but also how his values were in alignment with where he was at. And so we decided to make that the conversation for the conference. So we ended up opening the conference up here in Brisbane in May, and we asked the audience that same question. And what motivates someone to go from competency to proficiency? So this conversation that we're having is about that. It unpacks those the results that we got, because we didn't do the work. I wasn't there to tell anyone what the answer was on that. I didn't have the answers. I was really curious, though, of what the room had and the answers the room had, because this is the work that the council is going to use in developing its processes, developing its systems, developing its ideas, moving forward to help connect people into their excellence. So welcome to this conversation. There are so many incredible points along the way. Remember, it doesn't just relate to the resource industry. This could be picked up and put anywhere. They're all essential conversations that need to have. So welcome on in to a conversation that can really make a difference. So thank you for joining me, Rodo. This is really exciting to be able to unpack what we did together at the Resource Training Council conference recently. Thanks for coming in to do this.
Thank you very much for having me.
That conference was great for so many different reasons, but it was a change in direction for the Resource Training Council, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it's looking at the future and looking at the way we can do things differently. When we look back in history, I don't think when we look back in the past 30 years, we have changed our approach to training remarkably. However, we're still seeing a number of issues, incidents, people getting hurt, people even getting killed. So I think there's an opportunity where we fundamentally look at the way we train in the resources sector and look at how we can do things differently moving forward.
Which I love. Anytime that I hear an industry leader say it's time to change and then start doing something about it, there's this relief point for myself to be able to go, okay, great, now the conversation started. So the resource sector, so everyone understands, is mining, drilling,
oil and gas, quarrying, all those related resource industries.
Which employs tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people every year.
Correct.
Across Australia.
Absolutely. In a lot of different environments, and unfortunately quite a few of those are quite high-risk environments, and that's why this is so important.
And high risk, not just physically, but high risk psychologically as well, because there's a lot of fly in, fly out.
Absolutely. You tend to have in these isolated locations people working away from their families for extended periods of time, and that can be an issue for some people, and that needs to be factored in. And more focus is coming onto that, which is really good. Can we do more? Yes, I believe we can. We just got to keep striving forward to improve.
Wonderful. So this conversation sits in the training aspect. There are so many things that, come into that. And what we spoke about, early on the piece when we were planning for this conference was, what motivates someone to go from competency to proficiency? Why would someone reach and excel? Like what is that thing that has someone, wanting to do more than just the average? And it's such an interesting question, isn't it? Like what it kind of came down to.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed those conversations because I've often thought about it in a different context, from a safety point of view. And what it came down to was individual motivation. What motivates people to stay safe, to go home at the end of their shift each day. And for us to stumble across that conversation from a training context was fantastic. And the similarities are there. So
what we did is we went to the conference and we asked audience members. So the audience members in this conference were from RTOs, people who are trainers themselves. And what other groups of people were in the audience?
So we had registered training organisations. We had mine owners, so asset owners. We had large mining companies. We had contracting companies, and a lot of other support organisations that provides support services and products to the mining industry.
So these are people with these answers, aren't they?
That's right.
But we really wanted to work at reframing how the industry saw this conversation, particularly instead of a blame or a weakness aspect that, we tend to go towards, the strengths aspect, and so we had these definitions and we asked the audience these definitions around, what is competency? So I'm just going to, we took snapshots of this along the way, and the answers from the audience was the knowing and the understanding of a task, demonstrating the ability to complete a task, and knowing what to do when something goes wrong. From a legislative point of view, that's all that's asked for, isn't it?
Correct. Absolutely. And the audience participation there and their definition of competence was very, very similar to the wording in the legislation. However, what's interesting was the questions that came after that: is competence enough?
Mm. Is it?
And when you have a look at the definition of competence, the demonstrated skill to perform a task safely, if we put it in a very simple term, when you dig down, perhaps it's not. Actually, I don't believe it is, because to be able to do a particular task safely once, I always look at I use the analogy of a learner driver. Mm. They are in training when they're on their L's. However, when they do their test and they get their red P's, essentially they're deemed competent because they can go and drive a vehicle on their own. However, does that make them a good driver? Mm-hmm. Would you use a red P learner driver to then go and train someone else? No, you wouldn't. And so for me, that's a very simple answer, that competence, although it's important, it's only the beginning of the journey, and that the training needs to continue.
Not just that, let's look at the risk factors and risk associations with it. Insurance companies, if you're under 25, aren't going to insure, learner drivers, P-plate drivers, even if they've got a couple of years under their belt, in the same way as someone who's been driving for a long period of time. So insurance companies don't deem them safe. They're at higher risk. Car rental companies, to be under 25 and rent a car is, next to impossible. So there's this known quantity. Like, that's an acceptable understanding of it.
Absolutely. There's known statistics out there across Australia, if we just looked at Australia, but it's across the world. But young drivers in their first few years of driving are known to be in the highest percentile of people that are going to be involved in an accident. As you pointed out, your insurance premium for an 18-year-old versus a 45-year-old, it's probably double. So it just demonstrates that although they may have been deemed competent to operate that vehicle, they're not ready in entirety. There's a lot of skill that still needs to be learnt over time before that they, are recognised as being a good driver.
Because there was this part of the definition that was given to us about knowing what to do when something goes wrong. And it's like, really? In what environments? Maybe if it's dry, maybe if it's one person in the car, maybe if they don't have the radio on loud, maybe if they don't have all of these other factors going on. But if you throw all of those things into the mix in the bad weather, do they know what's going on? Probably not,
no.
Because they haven't had the experience of having to deal with that hard time before to know that they, can get out of it, but the resource and the tool to be able to know what to do with that piece of machinery to navigate.
Absolutely. As a great example there again, if a young person goes for their driver's licence in Queensland in the middle of winter, the likelihood of rain in most cases are very low, so they're going to be driving and learning to drive and dealing with situations in a pretty good environment. However, you throw in the storm season in
February.
Exactly. And then you've got slippery roads, you've got all other factors involved, poor visibility. They haven't been confronted with that situation before. So that poses a real problem. So to be truly competent or beyond competent, that takes time. You need to experience a lot of different scenarios before you can achieve that.
Well, and this is where I want to unpack proficiency. So, in the training industry, in the resource training industry, what are we looking at in terms of proficiency? What are we meaning there?
So it's going well beyond that competence. So it's not just demonstrating the skill to perform a task safely, but you're demonstrating to perform the skill safely, efficiently, productively, in a range of circumstances, and being able to deal with a range of different outcomes. And as we mentioned before, environmental situations and changes, being able to manage those changes. It's someone that has achieved proficiency over time that they are efficient and productive, they're the ones that you'll be looking to train up your new young people or new people to the industry to gain competence and send them on their journey. So I think there's a big difference, and I don't think it's been well enough realised in the industry. I think there's been an acceptance in the past that once someone achieves the tick of competence, that's it. They're free to roam and be free and do as they please, But I don't think we're there. I still believe that's part of the beginning of the journey, moving towards proficiency and then beyond that mastery is what we need to be looking at.
What does it take within someone to want proficiency? Because it's not a you must do or you must be. So there's no one saying, authoritatively, you got to do this. Someone's got to want that. Yeah. This is where we brought in that idea of this motivation.
Absolutely. And this is the interesting part, because motivation is the key here. And motivation is a deeply personal thing.
Yes.
So what motivates yourself versus myself could be two vastly different things. If I look back to when I was an operator in an underground mine, what motivated me? Well, I wanted to progress. I didn't want to be just driving a truck for my entire career. I wanted to move on to the next job. I wanted to be accepted by my crew, my mates that I was working with. I wanted to be recognised by management as a good worker and someone with potential to keep moving on. I wanted to feel valued. So this is the personal things that motivated myself to want to go from competent to proficient, to demonstrate that I could further my career. And there's other things like the financial rewards as well.
Well, and this is, when I asked you that question originally and you brought up this answer, it's just like, wow, like this is fascinating, because what you're talking about is you understand your own value that you bring into a place, and you're motivated to develop those skills, develop those internal resources that you have. You want to be valued for those things, whether it's camaraderie from your mates or financial from the organisation, but also being able to be seen as that person who's going to be progressive. But then this values bit is, this was important to you to be seen in this light as well.
Yes.
And what we came up with was, wouldn't it be fascinating if everyone in the room came up with a similar type of idea on it?
Yes.
And they did.
Absolutely.
And so, when we're talking about motivation, we asked the audience, to define motivation. And we got a little bit of niggles in the crowd. It was really interesting because they said, well, that's an individual thing. It's like, yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you recognize that. So it's a personal thing. So we noted that down. For some people, their motivation wasn't the definition of the word, but they're motivated by going home safe.
Yes.
So it's really forefront of mind. Looking after your mates was a motivation. To be proficient means that there's more capacity to look after their mates. It's a driving force. So that it's like this impetus, this, urge to do better, and then can be both internal and external. So when we're talking about motivation, yes, it is a very personal thing, and it sits in those, how you value yourself, how you want to be valued, and then how do you align your values with the team you're in and the organization you're in. And so if we're looking at motivating someone to go from competency to proficiency, we got to understand there's these internal factors, but what's external that we can influence?
Absolutely. If we understand first and foremost that it is a deeply personal thing, I think that will change the way we approach it.
In what way?
Because I think you need to get to know people on an individual level, and not have a defined way of doing things. Understanding that what makes a good team is a diverse team. You need a diverse team to be successful, and you need to be able to allow those people to flourish and foster their motivations. and understand first and foremost that it is a personal thing, and what motivates us isn't going to necessarily be what motivates those. Understand the differences, and create an environment where people's can be supported, and identify their motivators, and build on that.
Because to me, that starts with a conversation. Hi, it's Julie here. I just wanted to take a quick break in the middle of all of this and thank you for listening. And also to reach out and say, hey, I would love your support in this podcast, in helping me to grow it and helping me to get it into more listeners' ears and to see us as well. There's so much content in here, and I'm looking forward to you being a part of all of this. So now back to the conversation. Anytime that I speak to business leaders or, organizations, and, I say to them, well, have you asked that person, have you asked that individual, what that means to them? It's like, God, I have to talk to every person. So the answer is always different depending on the situation. But in this context, what we're doing is we're training people, we're giving people the resource, the tools, and the ability to increase their capacity to do better, to become proficient. What's that conversation then look like? Is it with an individual or?
I believe so. I'll give an example again from a safety point of view. We had a particular site in a previous role that was performing really poorly. We had a lot of injuries, a lot of incidents occurring, and we put in a safety intervention plan. One of the items on that plan was that from supervisor level to management, they had to spend time in the field getting to know each individual employee, taking the time to get to know them.
How did that go down?
Surprisingly, when we put pen to the paper, initially there was resentment. But once people started doing it, it was fantastic. Now, if I was to say there were 10 items on that improvement plan, if there was one item that made the biggest difference, it was that one. All of a sudden, we had supervisors and managers taking time out of their busy schedules to get to know employees on a personal level. The turnaround in the culture and the turnaround in that workplace in general, it was palpable. You could feel it. It was amazing. And everyone went, wow, I didn't think that would have such a big effect. So I think it is a very personal thing. I don't think it's something that, yes, there are group activities. However, it needs to start at an individual level from all levels within your organisation and then grow from there.
Because I was brought up in manufacturing, and my dad always said to me, if you don't have your feet on the ground, if you're not walking the shop floor with your teams, you're not going to know anything or anyone. And I just went, oh God, that sounds all right. And he goes, yeah, just see how it works for you. And so I thought I could manage a manufacturing plant from a computer screen. Didn't work so well. Dad was right, again. And so the moment that I started walking the shop floor, and, the guys might have problems with, the machine or something like that, and I'd get in and say, well, what does that do? And, what's your process look like? And gee, that seems really tough. What do you want to do about it? And these conversations started to the point I'm then under the machines and working with them and pulling things apart and participating with them. Everything did change. But it started with what's that about? Can you tell me what's happening there? What's that like to work within that process?
Absolutely. The way I picture it is work imagined versus work done.
Such a simple.
We often imagine how it should be done or how we think it's being done, but until we actually get out and get onto the shop floor and actually talk with the people that are doing the job day in, day out and see how it's actually been done, we're living in a dream world. So we need to understand that. And if we bring it back to a training perspective, why would we try and train someone in a way that we imagine a job should be done, when in all reality it's going to be done totally different. We've lost the opportunity. So we need to take the time to understand how it is being done. Perhaps that's even a better, more efficient or more proficient way of doing it than our training has anyway, because they've worked it out, and we haven't. So it is really, really important.
So it's not even just the individual, going through the training, it's the trainers, it's the programs, industry councils that are going, well, what is it that we're training? Are we talking at people and giving them a list of things that they can do, but how applicable is that? So we're taking training that might have been competent over the years. How do we make the training, how do we make the interaction with that training proficient?
And I think in this case, there needs to be some form of freedom within a framework. So when we train people, we realise that, yes, this is how you operate this piece of machinery. However, if your environment changes, it starts raining, or you loss of visibility, or something happens in your workplace that you cannot follow that direct guideline, we need to be able to empower the people to be able to modify the way they're doing the job to continue to do it safely. And if they can't, stop the job. But just to box people into a single way of doing things is unrealistic. And you see a lot of training done for compliance sake. They're trying to tick a box. So they are very prescriptive about how something needs to be done. Now, it's important to have guidelines. However, we cannot account for every different change that may occur in the workplace. So we need to be able to help people understand that and deal with it, so that when something does change, they don't get hurt. They can modify the way they do things to suit those changes, or stop the job if necessary.
And be empowered to do that.
Absolutely, and supported.
Because on the flip side of what motivates someone was this idea of the potential of someone being demotivated, where someone might be reaching for proficiency, or they're staying in competency because of a factor. What are some of the things in and around that demotivates people, do you think?
Again, I think it's pretty much the opposite of what we talked about in the motivating side of things. But I think this is where we can control an environment and create an atmosphere that demotivates people. You can have a toxic work environment.
Yeah.
You can, if you're showing favouritism, you've got someone that is absolutely working their hardest to progress, and then they see someone else in the workplace that isn't performing very well, getting all the opportunities. That can be very demoralising or demotivating. And exactly. So there's a lot of factors there that we could potentially influence in our workplace that will demotivate people and not want them to strive forward. And I think that's a dangerous place for a work environment. If we've got the bad work environment that's demotivating everyone, I think we're in trouble.
Because when we're demotivating someone, what we're actually doing is devaluing them.
Correct. Yeah.
Not just not valuing them and letting them know they're valued, but the value that they place on themselves can be stripped away, right?
Absolutely.
This is why this topic's so relevant to mental health and the work that I do, and talking about well-being and being able to show up and be your best self. Well, you can't do that if you're, consistently being devalued and having these things, I don't know, not just taken away from you, but shown as you're not important.
Absolutely. And I saw a good example last week. I was out visiting a mine site, and at their pre-shift meeting, the words of encouragement amongst the crew and the supervision and management at these meetings was fantastic. So it was an example.
Tell me, what does it sound like?
Well, it was acknowledging people for the effort that they were putting in. People thanking their workmates publicly in front of the work group for coming and helping them when they were stuck with a really difficult task. Talking
They're simple
about
things, Rodo.
They're such simple things, but people were going to work in a positive frame of mind. There was an example of what good looks like, and there's plenty of examples, unfortunately, what bad looks like, which is the opposite, which is just talking about the negative, what's not going right all the time, and putting people down for not doing the right thing. But I think in time that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If it's all about the negative, you're going to get a negative result. So you've got to be really careful and pick your times when you're having certain conversations.
But I love how simple that was, because I think the difference between doing it, badly and doing, it good is that conversation of acknowledgement and valuing, one another. Because I think change starts from the middle up. I don't think it starts top down. It's nice to have the encouragement. But in the middle, like if you've got a group of people that go, hey, buddy, you came in the other day and I was having a tough time and you just were able to help me, figure out the solutions for it. I just needed that extra resource. Cool. Thanks, mate. In front of other people, that feels so good. Like there's a bit of belonging that goes on there. You've got great, good brain chemicals happening at the same time too. So everyone gets uplifted and catches that good stuff. But it just starts from that simple acknowledgement.
Absolutely. It's not a difficult thing.
No. But are they seen as soft if they do that, or weak, or? No,
because when you, again, with this example, these are all tough, gruff underground miners, and they had no difficulty saying thank you. It was basic acknowledgement for help and hard work. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not being soft by acknowledging that. The positive outcomes from those sort of conversations before people go to work are outstanding. One of the things that we spoke of briefly before the conference too was, creating safe environments. I think that's an important aspect if you need to, especially if you need to talk about something that may not be all about the positive, and sometimes we need to have tough conversations. You need to create a safe environment to have those conversations.
And what does that look like? In that environment, in that, good example, what did that look like, that safe environment?
Well, the safe environment, when there were certain conversations that need to be had, they weren't done publicly. They were, taken aside, and they were done in a very respectful way, having a conversation and then finishing off on a positive, So they weren't sending people away just with a boot up the butt and saying, you did a bad job. Unpack what that bad job looked like, what could have been done differently or better next time, and get a bit of commitment to improve, rather than, a public shaming.
Because it comes into that, how's that person feel their value is being brought into a work environment? How's it being valued? And then, so it's just sitting in that space once again, isn't it?
That's right. Absolutely. You want to create that camaraderie, that sense of being part of that team. You want to foster that sort of atmosphere because you want mates looking after mates. It was interesting, our charity partner is Mates in Mining. But that whole notion of mates looking after mates is a very powerful thing, especially if you're working in a high-risk work environment. The last thing you want is someone walking past you when you're doing something terribly unsafe and not having the courage to speak up and say, hey, mate, stop what you're doing. There's got to be a better way we can do this.
And that's the work that Mates in Construction does.
Yes.
Yeah. I love their organisation, and absolute shout out to them, because they're teaching a language and a framework for it to be able to step in and start these conversations.
That's right.
And it's because it is that small of a thing. As you said, being able to publicly thank and acknowledge one another, there's such small ways of being able to start these conversations.
Absolutely.
So, because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, In terms of training industry, that gap between someone who's motivated and someone who's demotivated, we can't always change the organization's perspective. We can't always change, some of these outlying source points of stressors. But how can we help someone to go from being motivated, going from demotivation into motivation, in terms of training?
I guess it depends on the factors. But again, if we get to know someone on a personal level and find out what the demotivating factors are, perhaps we can, foster an environment which will help them become motivated. However, sometimes it takes courageous conversations too. Not always is it the work environment that is entirely the issue. And this doesn't come natural to a lot of people. It's difficult to have a courageous conversation with someone if someone isn't fitting in or is disruptive for a certain reason. And we need to be able to have those conversations and try and work a way forward.
So whose role is that becoming to have those courageous conversations?
Well, look, you'd like to think that people, mates, can have those courageous conversations. But if it's not happening at that level, then it needs to become the supervisor and the manager if it needs to escalate that way. But again, if you've got a good working environment, you should have mates pulling up mates and saying, hey.
Because that's where it starts.
That's where it starts.
Because I know one of the points that came up in at the conference was this idea that supervisors have this massive responsibility for looking after the well-being and the motivation of the people, in their team. But they're not trained to do that, or, there are these limiting factors. And it seems to be this load that gets put onto supervisors. How do we keep them motivated?
Well, I think historically it's a well-known fact that quite often in the resources sector, the best operator gets promoted into being the next supervisor. Just because they're a great operator doesn't necessarily make them a great supervisor. They're two totally different skill sets. I don't believe as an industry now, there are pockets of good out there, don't get me wrong. But as in general terms, I don't think we do enough to provide the training to give people that aren't natural supervisors or managers the training for the skill sets that they need to become an effective supervisor. So you end up loading up a supervisor without the required skills, so naturally you're not going to get the best outcome.
And you're taking your best operator off the tools.
That's right.
So it's a lose-lose situation.
That's right. And that's where we need a framework. And, what does a good supervisor look like? If we understand the qualities of that supervisor, then perhaps we won't be looking at the best operator. We'll be just looking at any operator and go, you know what? Joe over there, he hasn't done every possible job known to man. He's not our gun operator, but wow, he's got some leadership attributes. Maybe that's the person we need to be targeting. So I think we need to think more holistically about each individual role because, again, your best operator is possibly best left as an operator if you're talking about safe productivity on your mine site. They're going to get your best outcomes.
Well, then it doesn't the conversation then be because you don't want to demotivate that best operator by not giving them the promotion. That maybe there's, that part of the conversation then be, that this is the line of sight for people. Like for our great operators, people who want to be on the tools and stay on the tools. What does progression and what does proficiency look like? What does reward, recognition, and those things look like to you? And being able to actually have that conversation of, well, what is it that you want? Like I've had a number of people over the years and in sales roles as well as, in the manufacturing side where it's like, don't you dare give me the management role. And it's like, well, what motivates you to keep doing good at what you're doing? And they've just gone, just keep paying me. I'm fine. I love my job. Just get out of my way.
Yeah.
I can do that. So you don't want to be a manager? Oh, God, no. Well, who would you want to manage you? What does that person look like? To respect and honor your skill set and being the best operator we've got. How do I make sure we don't have this competition that goes on? Because I want to make sure you're acknowledged and validated too. So maybe the conversation starts there. Like, if I am going to promote someone who's a good natural leader, I don't want to be devaluing my great operators.
No, that's right.
Because there's no other progressive.
No, and again, some of these great operators may have aspirations to become supervisors. Well, then we need to help enable that by giving them the skill sets that they need. And that's a conversation, again, saying, you're a great operator. Yes, we would love to see you as a supervisor. However, there's some skills that you need to learn over time to become that great supervisor also, and put a program in place. And then that gives them direction also. It gives them purpose, because one, they're still, doing really well at what they're doing, but learning new skill sets to take them to the next level.
Because being given the opportunity to grow is also motivating for a lot of people. Not just, but some people don't want that. So yeah, it becomes that individual conversation from, right, you're doing this, what do you want it to look like from here on in? So the conversations are starting earlier. When people are working and yes, there's competency, but it's spotlighting those who are driven to reach, wanting to become proficient, that, those types of conversations get to happen.
Yeah, look, I think organisations do it well have career pathways mapped out. They understand the skills necessary for each of the roles that you'll need to perform on that pathway. So I think that's what organisations really need to look at. What does progression look like in your organisation?
That's a great starting question, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's simple.
Absolutely.
If you're a business owner and you've got, whether it's resource industry or anywhere else, and you've got a team of people that just seem to be struggling, what does your progressive pathway look like for them? Well, if you don't have a clear answer, that might be where things are starting from. How do you let people know they're valued is really the question, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that will help you as an organisation gain clarity. And help create a positive environment which is motivating for your workers. If there is a defined pathway, there is known skills required to be on that journey, it might make it a hell of a lot easier.
And I really invite these business owners who are having a tough time, instead of trying to make that up on your own or, bring in a consultant straight away to have the answer for you, ask your people.
Absolutely.
I bet they'll tell you.
Absolutely.
We figured that out at the conference. We just said, we're going to ask everyone and see what happens, because the answers are already in the room. We just got to give them voice. We just got to give them, permission to speak out and listen.
That's right. And it comes back to that notion of work imagined versus work done. The way we imagine it might not be the way that they imagine it. So that's where you need to talk to the people that are doing the job to get the real answers.
And what a great introduction to having that conversation of, I've imagined how this has been done and, I've built the business based on how I've imagined it should be done. But what's the reality check?
Yeah.
You're saying, I wish more.
Yes.
Yes, we want to have that conversation. And I think that's any business owner or anyone coming into a new role, to be able to go, I've imagined what this is, but, I need to walk around and see what it's actually going to look like.
Yeah, I think it's a great starting point for any business to really think about that and walk the talk, so to speak, and get the feedback.
Yeah. I know we could keep talking about these topics. So I just want to thank you so much for letting me come into your conference and poke around and prod at your members and to ask these questions. And it was fascinating to be able to do.
Absolutely. And everyone got a lot out of it. It was a good way to start the conference, start the conversations, which set the tone for all the presentations to come afterwards.
Made it a really interesting conference, I must say. I look forward to next year. So I've got 3 questions that I ask all my guests. It's part of my research and my fun. So fill in the blank. A conversation can
have a positive outcome, even if it starts with a negative topic.
That's cool. Yeah. Just takes the right intention, doesn't it?
That's right.
Okay. What has been the greatest lesson, good or bad, that you've learned about having conversations?
You need to listen.
Really?
As a young child, I tend to race ahead way too much. So one of the big lessons that I learnt was that you really need to listen and you need to try and understand the other person's point of view. You need to have empathy. If you want a good outcome, you need to try and understand it from both sides. If you only understand it from your side, I don't think you're going to end up with a good outcome.
There's this idea, and I can see it, this young Rodo just like kind of racing ahead, and what you're talking about is pacing yourself and slowing down.
Absolutely.
Going at the same pace as the person with you so you can hear them.
Yes, absolutely. Taking the time.
Yeah, making the time. Last question. What is something you would like others to know about having difficult conversations?
Courageous conversations don't come easy. However, they're so important. And they're only difficult when you start the conversation. Once you start the conversation, it's remarkable how easy it will become. The courage is only to engage that person initially. Once you've made that contact and you start engaging, you'll be surprised how quickly and easily things flow from there.
So they're not difficult conversations. It's taking a bit of courage to get started.
Absolutely. And I see that if I go back to a safety analogy, if you're walking past someone using a grinder and there's metal shards and sparks going everywhere and they're not wearing safety glasses, do you feel the courage to go and tap that person on the shoulder and say, hey, go and put some glasses on? A lot of people don't have courage. They might feel that person's been doing the job 20 years. I've only been in the job for 1 month. He's going to snap. But quite often that person will respect you because you have a genuine concern for that person. So it's just having the courage to stop and ask or talk. Once you're there, everything becomes a lot easier.
And if you do get a reaction, just being able to say, look, I'm sorry that I've created this reaction. I just wanted to let you know that I cared by stopping you doing something that might have hurt you.
Absolutely. If all our conversations are underpinned by care, so when we're talking about safety and we're talking about training, if we have that care at the core of our conversations, very rarely will they go wrong.
Yes, absolutely, wholeheartedly agree. And that's why I'm doing the podcast. Because I want people to know that and see that. And it's not just me spouting on about it. It's across industry, across scenarios. And it sits in every aspect of how we turn up as humans.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Rodo. I really appreciate being included in your conference that you had last month and for you then coming in and unpacking it a little bit further so more than just your members can get this idea of what's happening and what this conversation looked like. across the board. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you for joining me for that conversation with Rodo De Boer from the Resource Training Council. As I said, it could be any industry. And I've seen it in manufacturing. I've seen it in construction. I've seen this across all sorts of spaces. And there are so many great takeaways that I'm sure you'll have your own, and we'll have a few reflection points that we'll pick up on. But there's just a few that I wanted to highlight. Rodo is so passionate, and there's this quiet passion. You know, it's not overstated. It's not loud in any particular way, but it's a driving force that I've seen on a few occasions now where he's passionate to change the current and the past processes of training, like how people turn up in the training space. There's this belief that it's what changes the risk of turning up to work in the resource industry, is how people are trained and how people are engaged into training. Because if we can understand the individual and the individual's motivations, then we can understand how they're valued. So we support them in when they do reach. Because it's a risk to reach. It's a risk to want more because there's this vulnerability that comes along with it. So to be able to understand what motivates someone to that, it gives us that framework of what we can do to support someone. And these conversations, they start at, so many different areas. And I love this idea. And like my brain exploded, as it generally does in these conversations. But my brain exploded with this quote from Rodo of work imagined versus work done. I don't care where you are in an organization or what type of business you're in, even in families, no matter what, work imagined is the story we tell ourselves compared to real work done. This is the start of any conversation of, I'm thinking something's done in a particular way. Can we have a conversation to how it's actually done? I need to know. Can you tell me about that? Can you tell me why you do that? What's this part of the process? What does it mean to you? What are the sticking points? What are the obstacles? This is just a robust conversation that gives you an idea of how you can support someone. There's no shoulda, coulda, wouldas. There's no if, but, maybes. The storytelling of how you're seen as a leader or how you're seen in this has got nothing to do with the work done, because what you've imagined comes completely out of it. It's no longer relevant. You get to know the real. This is how also you show someone that they're valued, because you're giving them a voice. You're giving someone a voice by asking them, how is this work done? You've given them an audience. So you're there, you're listening, be ready to listen. And then you're showing them acceptance by going, well, there's a lot of solutions here to the problems that we've been having. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing these ideas with me. I really appreciate it. That is a transformational conversation. Like that changes how people turn up in a workspace, because this is how someone knows that they're respected, they're being valued. It's not about, getting pay rises and shown, a process of how to, do anything different. The human's been acknowledged. You've probably got a lot of your own other points in this. I'd love to hear what your takeaways were in this and how you can relate this to the industry that you're in. Please, if there's someone that you want to start a conversation with where you do want to change a process, or where you do, want to start better conversations as a team, as an organization, as an industry, share this conversation with that person and start that conversation, because I know that it will make a difference for you. Would love to hear your feedback. And please do leave a reviews, do leave a rating, whatever it is on your platform that is there and available. It helps us to do this and do more of this. And if you've got suggestions of people that you'd like me to have a conversation with, I would love to hear that too. So mind you, I've got a plan of who I want to talk to, but if you've got someone in particular that goes, this person needs to be heard, I'm happy to have that conversation. So thank you for listening, and watching, and look forward to the next episode.